big welcome and thanks to everybody for joining us today. My name is Andrew Gilmore and I'm the Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation in Berlin. I don't think I really need to introduce the topic very much today. It is, after all, I think most people are agreed, it is perhaps the biggest crisis since the Berlin airlift of 1948, and that the last time a major war started in Europe with the invasion of one country by another was 1939. The Berghoff Foundation was set up 50 years ago, precisely to reduce tensions between East and West Europe. After the end of the Cold War, like many other people, we turned our attention to matters in Africa, Middle East, and Afghanistan, and places like that. But of course, now we need to revisit our original mandate, and we will be certainly going back and looking at Eastern Europe in a different way. And we have a major interest in exploring all possible means of peace building and mediation. Although I assume that task has been made even more daunting by the rather horrifying discovery last weekend of what appears to be just the start of a pattern of war crimes carried out against Ukrainian civilians by the Russian invaders. It would be too early, of course, to call it genocide, but there are certainly aspects of the language being used, the discourse, the dehumanization of Ukrainians, the endless talk about denazification and the implications this has for how Ukrainian civilians deserve to be treated. That is very, very worrying. And I don't know if it's irony or not, but it is almost precisely now the 30th anniversary of the siege of Sarajevo that descended 3 years and a bit later into what was undeniably the genocide of Srebrenica. We have today a fascinating and brilliant lineup of people: Natalia Gumyanyuk, Lamberto Zanier, Kateryna Busol, and Jörg Lau. And I will introduce some more when I pose the first question to them. But the first person I wanted to ask a question to is to you, Natalia. You are a well-known journalist in Ukraine and now being published all over the world. And I know you're currently focused on human rights violations, war crimes, and the struggle to ensure that one day there will be justice. But can I ask you first, how do you envisage us getting past the current terrible mood on both sides? And in light of the clear atrocities that we can see, how will that, in your view, will the Ukrainian leadership try to ensure, and hopefully succeed in ensuring, that there aren't sort of reprisals carried out against Russian prisoners, which would be an understandable reaction given the rage, but it would be morally and politically disastrous were it to happen. But what could be done to try to stop things descending into a really, really disastrous spiral of violence?
Hi, good to talk to everybody. I'll try to be concise and probably explain also that background from which I'm talking. And just now, some minutes ago, I'm back from the funerals in the village in the Kiev region, where the head of the village, a very nice village, it's elected head of this village, a lady in her 50s, had been tortured together with her husband, who has been tortured to the extent that they were burying him in the closed coffin, and their son, who was in their 20s. The whole village gathered to greet them and saying those people died for us, because they actually did. They were the family which helped to bring the medicine, food, evacuate people, go somewhere to charge the phones. And they were, at one moment, they were in the very end of the Russian occupation, they were abducted and then found in that way brutally murdered in the forest nearby. Very, very grief. I think like I've been to a lot of funerals, I've been to a lot of places, but the situation when the funerals are always sad and bad, but the situation when the people really died and all the 300 people who remained in the village walked and said those people died because they didn't leave and stayed in our village to help us, and we can be extremely grateful for them. There were a lot of old people as in village. They were comparing everything because they survived the Second World War. It was exactly, you know, the old ladies in Ukraine, they do not call them Russians, they call them Germans. That's something to understand. They call Russians Germans. They do not use, they have something in their mind. But to speak about the, what would be the end to that? And also, I think it's very important to explain from which position I'm speaking. There is Katya, you represented some people. For 8 years, I've been participating in all the possible dialogue groups regarding the Donbass and Russia. We were in Turkey, elsewhere, talking to these DNR people. It was not very popular, but I was engaged, very much engaged into that, to extent it's possible for the journalists. There were some Russians from the Russian side to whom I still remain in touch, and who still write me sometimes. And one of those persons, of course, I won't name that person, just this week after Bucha listened to my live on CNN, where I was saying the only thing that after 1 month, after 40 days and after Bucha, we see that there is nothing else which stopping so far Russia, apart from military actions of the Ukrainian military, which are, you know, freeing those towns and not letting the other towns to occupy. What that person wrote me from Russia saying, you are perfectly right. There is nothing else that the Ukrainian troops on the ground, but the Ukrainian troops on the ground who are able to influence at least a bit to the Kremlin. Just them, just the military action of Ukrainian military can stop advance, nothing else. That is a starting point for the discussion now. So I think it is there where if there is a moment where we manage to free at least those territories prior to 24th of February, then we can start the negotiations. And shortly, finally, I think we should really give a credit to the, I'm independent journalist, I'm not supporting the government, you know, like that's not my role, I'm very cautious about that. Incredible credit to the appeal of the President Zelensky. In every single address which he does every single day, he put all this energy and all these emotions of the people to the humanity, talking to the opportunity to take care about the people instead of kind of feeling anger. He never really, he appeals to Russians all the time. He always tries to make it very clear that the guilty are, for instance, are the Russian army. It's not all the Russians. He still tried to differentiate it. And his approach is extremely humanistic. And finally, both him said, you know, that we don't want to win from this war as 300 Spartans. I'm just coming back from the Donbass, where we're waiting for the major assault talking to the governors there, and they say that, you know, it's very hard for us. We cannot evacuate everything, but we need to defend those towns from being occupied. But also, we do not want to leave this just the graves who would be then later announced as, you know, heroes. That's not the aim of the Ukrainians. However, at this moment, I see you started from 1945. We unfortunately are back to the times when some of the things could be contained in just with the military force, of course, with the sanctions, support, pressure, but really on the ground, the people could be saved just with the military force at this stage.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Natalia. Lamberto Zania, you are the former Secretary General of the OSCE and a former UN Special Representative and veteran of the EU and much else. What is the role of international organizations in trying to either end the violence or to build a peace afterwards? Of course, Russia has the veto in the UN Security Council and is extremely powerful in the OSCE. But does that mean the international organizations are largely impotent, or is there something that they can do?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. And yes, of course, when we look at international organizations like the UN or the OSCE, preventing the conflict or addressing the conflict situation is the core mandate of the organization. But as you yourself point out, organizations cannot really act independently of the policy of their members. We require, leadership and vision and support of member states to be able to operate. And this is one of the problems we are encountering now. As we have built these organizations also around shared norms, shared principles, and we try to promote them, we see deviations from these norms and principles. So we find ourselves in trouble, making or promoting the observance in a way. In the case of the Russian Federation, for instance, at the beginning of the crisis, or even before, there were a number of steps that were taken in the OSCE in terms of activating early warning mechanisms. But these mechanisms were not effective because the Russian Federation did not really play ball. And so as they were requested information about what is called unusual military activities, we really didn't get the kind of information that would have been expected, and so there wasn't really discussion on how to try to prevent the invasion, or what later turned out to be an invasion. In the OSCE, I myself, as a Secretary General at the time, was heavily involved at the time of the Swiss and then the German chairmanships in establishing a very large presence of monitors on the ground, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. Now the budget had to be renewed at the end of March, and the Russian Federation blocked it. So at the time when there is mounting evidence of war crimes, so at the time when there is, I would say, an even higher need of a monitoring presence, the action of relevant international organization is being blocked by member states. And I think this has to be clearly denounced, because I think also this kind of behavior is giving an indication as to who has interest in making sure that there is no, how can I say, visibility of what is happening on the ground, which is, of course, very deplorable. In the background, there is also a debate. Well, we've seen President Zelensky's speech at the Security Council the other day, and we heard what he had to say about also the reform of the US, of the composition of the Council and its working methods. Something similar is happening in the OSCE. Now that I'm working with the Parliamentary Assembly, the Parliamentary Assembly has a majority voting system. There is a debate about expelling Russia, suspending the participation of Russia. And as we have seen, Russia is also out of the Council of Europe now. At the end of the day, however, one must wonder, is this useful? Even though one understands the reaction, the obvious reaction to these and why initiatives this kind are taken, isolating a country even more and removing it from the system of norms that we've built together, does it really help in the long run? In the Council of Europe, for instance, Russian citizens will not be able to use to go to to appeal their cases in the European Court of Human Rights if Russia is not a member. So in a way, citizens may suffer in a way from these moves. So we should also ask ourselves whether it is in our interest to do that. In terms of things that can be done by international organizations, the leadership can still act in a number of areas. First of all, there is a humanitarian and refugee crisis that requires a strong response by the international community and the support, and there is need for coordination and for strengthening the assistance and all that. And that's certainly an area where international organizations, the UN in the first place, I would say, but also the OSCE and others can assist. The political role, there is a need for a political process. We see that there is resistance. Some players have tried to do something. We're watching also what Turkey is now doing. There is little transparency. There is a fear that this might be a bit of a process which is not really producing the kind of substance, the kind of results we'd expect, especially in terms of an early ceasefire. My feeling is that there is, especially on the Russian side, the desire to establish facts on the ground before really starting a negotiation, engaging in a negotiation, which would be a problem for anyone. But perhaps having high level and high profile envoys appointed for a political dialogue and putting pressure through that might, in any case, be a useful step to take. And then there will be plenty of tasks once negotiations are ongoing, but of course that depends, and that's a longer kind of discussion. That depends on what the facts on the ground will be at that time and how the negotiation starts.
Thank you very much for that answer. Kateryna Busol, a Ukrainian international lawyer, who's a senior lecturer at the National University of Kyiv Military Academy, and formerly with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, an experience which I hope will become very relevant. Could I ask you, in light of our interests in peace building and in light of the discoveries last weekend of these war crimes, what are the implications of that, in your view? Are those discoveries, which probably you may have suspected all along, but the rest of the world was pretty shocked to see, what are the implications of that for peace building efforts?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the question. And I first would like to specify that I was a visiting professional with the International Criminal Court. I'm not and was not a staff member. As regards the peace building efforts, I think the major challenge we're facing now is what a possible ceasefire or a ceasefire proposal might bring. There has been a lot of pressure on Ukraine to agree to certain ceasefire conditions as proposed or hinted by Russia. But the experience shows, and this is the clear experience of the Minsk Accords, that Russia uses ceasefire to regroup militarily or for the sake of its own domestic propaganda, and also for the sake of preparing a new offensive. So when we're speaking about the peace building, I would be first and foremost concerned about agreeing, or rather not agreeing, to the possible ceasefire arrangements, which might actually solidify Russia's attempts to launch a new offensive, especially now as we're expecting it in the East. Speaking about the attitudes of Ukrainians, of the society, and also of the human rights community in terms of their expectations for the peace building, the human rights community in Ukraine and domestic investigators and prosecutors have been gathering the evidence of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict since 2014. For them, it has been appalling that the numerous reports of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, that the reports of Amnesty International, that the allegations by the Human Rights Watch, that the numerous evidence and communications to the ICC gathered by prominent human rights NGOs in the country, such as the Helsinki Human Rights Union, the Crimea Human Rights Group, the Regional Center for Human Rights, that this mass of evidence has not catalyzed action, stronger action by international policymakers, by regional policymakers, and by the International Criminal Court. We have seen that indeed there was a need for the new wave of aggression which was launched in February this year, and the incentive of 39 and then additionally to 41 in total states to refer the situation in Ukraine to the further stage within the ICC, to the stage of investigation. And this is something that has been appalling to the civil society, appalling to the victims community. And this is something, the accountability aspect is something that I'm quite sure will not be ready to negotiate or give any concessions to in a possible peace agreement and in the peace building efforts. There have been also quite a few questions as to whether the Ukrainians would agree to the limited investigation and prosecution of the Russian military and civilian leadership in response to or as a prerequisite to peace and ceasefire and the freezing of the current situation. And my feeling as a human rights lawyer who has worked with a number of survivor groups, including the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, is that these people socially, they will not accept such conditions. And I think the debates around the proposed so-called Steinmeier formula in 2019 have shown that there are certain red lines and certain concessions which Ukrainians as the society and especially the groups of survivors will not agree to. As regards the peace building efforts, I would also stress two other points. First, although everybody in Ukraine and internationally has been shattered by the unprecedented level of violence that we have witnessed since February 2022, it is very important that any peace building arrangement, any accountability mechanism also looks at what has been perpetrated since 2014, because the armed aggression and the armed conflict started with the occupation of Crimea. They didn't start in February 2022. And second, what I have been witnessing as an international lawyer and what is crucial to the viability of any peace accord, of any peace mechanism for the future, is the merger of the international expertise and the regional knowledge. The international lawyers that provide a lot of commentaries now on the qualification of Russia's action, on the ability and the modalities of prosecuting the aggression of the Putin regime, oftentimes do lack the insight into the regional Eastern European and post-Soviet and contemporary Ukrainian and contemporary Russian mentality, propaganda. And these are the aspects that must be taken into account for any successful peace accord in future.
Many thanks for that. Jörg Lau is the foreign editor of Die Zeit. And a lot of people noticed the huge reaction in Germany, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. And it's very interesting to hear a little bit about the longer term. I think many people feel, and perhaps is an opinion more widely felt outside Germany than inside Germany, that actually Germany's position on this is pretty much crucial and could even make the difference between whether President Putin can declare a victory or whether he can't declare a victory. And with a lot of talk about the Zeitenwende, but how big a turning point is it really? I mean, we know 100 billion has been assigned for defensive investments over perhaps the next decade. But how big a sum is that when you think that if the European powers are effectively, through gas and oil, sending $800 million a day, the equivalent of that 100 billion investment over 10 years is actually matched within 4 months of resources that can be put into President Putin's war effort. So I would love to hear your views on some of this, Jörg, and on where German public opinion and German policy might be headed.
Sure, thank you. Well, 100 billion euros sounds like a big sum. It actually isn't if you look at the state the German forces are in. I mean, there's a number going around. If we refill our depots, armament depots, to the level that is required by NATO, we are going to need 20 billion to do just that. So we're not talking about fancy new projects. It's about a rearmament of our forces that have been depleted over years. It's a huge problem for this government now. So this is, in my view, although the number is big, it's just the first step. And the same is true with the whole so-called Zeitenwende by Olaf Scholz. In if your reference point is German attitudes before the war, it's a big thing. It's a 180-degree turn when it comes to delivering weapons, when it comes to how we regard our relationship with Russia. But is it up to the task that we're facing now? I don't think so. We're just having a first brush with reality here. And I'm sorry to say that I'm very impatient with my own government here. This Zeitenwende by Olaf Scholz was an approach in the very last minute, under pressure by our neighbors, mostly in Eastern Europe, but also by the Americans, to finally do something and commit Germany to this conflict that is so existential also for us. So it's I'm really not sure, but I want to say one thing. There's a shock in this experience for the German foreign policy establishment that is also very relevant to the topic we're discussing here: peace negotiations and the role of diplomacy. Because until the last minute, the German government, and I traveled to Kiev with the chancellor something like 10 days before the war started. Until the last moment, the German government tried to revive the Minsk agreement, tried to revive the Normandy format, was talking about bringing OSCE more into the process. And one day after we were in Kiev, in Moscow, when the chancellor talked to Putin, he had to realize that it's no use, that that ship had sailed, and Putin was not interested in the Minsk agreement or any kind of concession about Russian language in Ukraine, or some deal about the so-called People's Republics. It was a much bigger thing for him, and this is a very shocking moment for, I think, not just Germany, to realize that this war of choice is driven so much by hate, by resentment, by ideology. And that calls into question what negotiations can actually be about if you realize that your opponent is driven by, not by some rational calculus about, just maximizing his power. It's something like a total war on a neighboring country. So that's, I don't have any recipes here, but this is something I think we have to realize before we start thinking about countermeasures.
I think there's a lot of people feel exactly that. What is the basis for discussions or negotiations in a situation like this, where the motivations of one side seem to be, as you suggest? Natalia, back to you again. Putting aside the humanitarian needs, which are massive and they must be met by people who care, and hopefully the governments will step up in order to provide that humanitarian need. In your view, what are the main needs of Ukrainian civil society at the moment, and how can outsiders best support those needs? And could I also ask a second question to you? I know you are currently embarking on a very important project of sort of training Ukrainians to collect testimony of war crimes, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the civil society, I think it's a moment when, and about the help. I think Ukrainians do appreciate a lot the help which is given, particularly for the people who are evacuated, who need treatment, because the whole country is under assault. But I can clearly say that the Ukrainians do not really want to have an idea that the money are spent into welcoming the refugees. Ukrainians largely do not want to leave. Kiev now feels with all the horrors, which is explained, is coming back to life. It's like a victory in Kiev that it would be, there is air sirens, but there are traffic jams, restaurants open, like people now, even in the village, I told people are coming back. By this week, there should be electricity and the internet connection and everything back in the areas, and the demining done in the cities near Kiev. And people are really urging to be back. So I think the most important thing is it's not to look at this crisis and this war in the point of view, let's help the poor people who are suffering and welcome the refugees. Not at all. People want it to be prevented, and they want to have the facility to be back and the more towns to be freed. So for Ukrainians, it's of course more or less all the ways of pressure on Russia. And we understand that in some cases there won't be the military aid. We understand that probably some organizations and some countries are reluctant. They would speak about any other, like financial help to rebuild the country, to let people be there, because the scale is incredible. You cannot evacuate all of those people. And I think what's something important to understand, I think we're still trying to look at the conflict. A lot of people trying to understand like why there is more solidarity to Ukrainians than to Syrians and things like that. I don't think that we should have this competition of victimhoods. It sounds horrible, but the difference is indeed it's a total war against the state. And Ukrainian civil society actually now is not fighting against the state, as happens in a lot of conflicts. We cannot separate ourselves from the states. Ukrainians want the state to be held. So our rescue workers work, so our hospitals work, so our government has the money to rebuild the infrastructure. That's actually a bit different call to support the government in rebuilding the country where it can rebuild, and to do what is legally necessary. On the project we will do, I think the most important is coordination. I think at the moment it's an interesting process. By the way, I want to have my correction. We said like what we found out after Bucha. We here knew what was going there still 20 days ago, because we have all the on-record testimonies from people who were coming. We know what's happening in those towns. We don't need to wait till things are freed, because it's not really we opened our eyes. So I think now there are a lot of organizations discussing how to record it. We're living in the 21st century. We really are able to identify the names, the people, the crimes, but the scale is incredible. So the most important is to really coordinate. Our task would be still, I'm speaking as a journalist, I think, to build it into a bigger narrative, to record the testimonies of so many people, but also to explain that it's not that what something has been told by my colleagues prior. It's a total war against the country, against the population. Call it genocide, qualify it in a different way, find another formulation, that Russia is fighting against the Ukrainian right to exist. That could be the point. But I think the most important to really explain this story and tell the story of those numerous people, so it's not really forgotten, and not just to grieve, but really to speak how we can, maybe it's not like prevent, it's really to say that all our current institutions, like Security Council, like OSCE, like Council of Europe, in fact, turn to be inefficient in defending civilians from this conflict. So the whole idea for us, and also for what we would do, is just really to think how we can reshape it, how we can make it different, so it again makes sense, and we would have the leverage to influence the Russia itself, but also the countries which would dare to invade their neighbors.
And just a quick word maybe from you on the work you're doing on training people to collect evidence.
So look, no. I think we don't really need to train that much people. The point is that the most important now is to record. Mariupol, it's 500,000 population. We know that now around 100,000 people had been evacuated. The scale, and each of those people had a story. It's still very dramatic to explain how to write down the story of 100,000 people, because every has an individual story, and and this is a story of the generation. So I do think that now it's most important, first of all, to combine this data. Of course, there are the legal trainings. Katya is here. A lot of international lawyers, humanitarian organizations would say, what is a protocol? It's very important that this is the impartial, let's say not impartial, it can be impartial, but like the objective testimonies based on facts, because there is nothing we need to exaggerate. The reality is bad enough to record what people says. So the most important is really to how they build a proper narrative of the testimonies of those people who Ukrainians, I wonder, would be ever capable to record. Our task would be to find the way to tell this story, to record it in the way which would be used in the court, but which would also explain how we get to this point where we are and how we can get out of this point.
Very much. Lambert Zanier, I was wondering, again, putting back your hats of your international organization's experience, whether you have any ideas as to what the eventual contours of an agreement might look like, and whether there might be a tendency, I mean, usually, and we know this, whether you and I, of course, work together in the Balkans, and it's always the stronger party in any given place that wants to keep out the UN, and the same in the Middle East as well, with Israel or in many other countries. The strong countries don't want the UN, and we know that. Actually, I was slightly involved in it myself in 2015 when President Poroshenko wanted the UN to come in as a form of peacekeeping, but the Russians didn't want that, and then they made it very clear in the last 2 months as well that they don't want UN involvement. Do you think that if it turns out that they're not getting their way, and of course there are suggestions that they're not getting their way now, but who knows what could happen, but if they really don't get their way, that they might actually turn to international organizations, and would that be more likely to be the UN, or would it be the OSCE to help them climb down, perhaps?
Of course, it's rather speculative at this point. My feeling is that Russia has no interest in engaging in a real negotiation until they have achieved their objectives on the ground, which is control whatever the coastline and as large a portion of territory as they can, and then they might wish to or be open to sitting down and starting talking for real. Whether this happens, it's another matter, because we'll have to see. One of the possible scenarios is that this conflict will become a very protracted one, unfortunately for the people on the ground, and that it may, come to some kind of a stalemate where, at the end of the day, the sides will be forced to sit at the table with a less clear situation on what is going on the ground and what the conclusions could be. That's where the space for I think a negotiation opens up, and here you could see many options and many possible scenarios involving international organizations. One of these, especially if there is no clear how can I say conclusion of the conflict, there could be an opening for some kind of a presence on the ground, either in the form of some kind of a peacekeeping operation, which could go in the direction of a UN operation, or a strengthened presence of the OSCE, a return to some kind of international monitoring, but under different circumstances, different mandate. However, given the strong militarization of the area, I think if we see any of these scenarios materialize, I would go more in the direction of a peacekeeping operation of some kind. But that should be a transitional element in any case, because we don't want, and I think we should all pay attention to avoid that any international presence ends up in freezing things on the ground too much. There should be, the space should be left for you know, a broader negotiation and possible scenarios. And that's where all the other bits come in, and they are very important, I think, in this negotiation. And you know, this is the complex of security guarantees, the future status of Ukraine, also the treatment or the addressing some of the issues we've seen on the ground affecting you know, minorities, etc. I agree with Jörg that some of these things were a bit of a cover up for a deeper feeling. And I think it's important also to understand what's gone wrong and why we've reached this stage. I think there are two sets of fundamental issues here at play. One is, and they both go back to the 90s, the end of the Cold War. One is the failure of the European community of states to create what was called at the time the Common European House. So we failed to reach a strategic agreement with Russia. And then at the end of the day, the expansion of NATO, which was not reformed, which remained the old NATO, what Russia kept seeing as the former adversary of the Cold War towards NATO's borders, was seen as increasingly aggressive by Russia. And this strengthened the nationalists, and it, you know, strengthened the hands of people like Putin at the end of the day. The second is the fact that Russia didn't feel comfortable in its new skin after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that's also you know, at the basis of this policy of reestablishing a zone of influence and the zone of respect, let's call it that way, of Russia in their own close neighborhood. And the Ukraine crisis, I always thought that when I was Secretary General, kept saying that while Crimea had its own logic and there was the history, there was Sebastopol, there were lots of things there, there were other specific. In the case of Donbass, I never really believed very much in Minsk, because I always thought that Donbass was about Ukraine, was not really about Luhansk so much. And it was really much more geopolitical. And we should keep this in mind, because these things will come back and haunt us in the next phase. And let's hope that the conflict doesn't last longer. We can open up this next phase and this discussion. There is discussion about the new European security architecture, and that issue should be there. So the question of the status of Ukraine and, you know, a formula of neutrality or something like this, if the Ukrainians are interested, because at the end of the day, it's their call as well. I think what is important, Ukraine, the way I see it, is also a victim of the fate of these failures, of these strategic failures in the relations between the West and Russia. And by wanting to join the West, it irritated Russia even more. So in a way, I think that the West is feeling, how can I say, somewhat guilty in its, you know, in seeing what is happening to Ukraine as a result of these policies. So these issues should be addressed in this negotiation. The West and the Europeans should play a key role, whether within the OSCE or within the UN, or within also a dialogue. I think that there is a need at some point for a dialogue between the Europeans and Russia. There should not only be a dialogue focusing on the economic issue, but it should focus primarily on the security issues. And if we find a solution where Ukraine feels safe, where we can hopefully go back to restoring the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but in conditions within which Russia does not feel threatened by the West, and this is obviously a big deal and something that is will not be easily achievable, then we will have given a perspective of longer-term stability Of course, what we have seen now, the consequence of the conflict might be a hugely complicating factor, because these war crimes that we are seeing will, in fact, be a major also impediment in trying to reach an accommodation. Some of the things that are happening, there may be no easy way back. And the same applies to the larger picture, where the UN will be called also to address, the impact on the wider European global economy of what is happening, and also the global governments and the the new system of international relations in future might be affected permanently by the consequences of this conflict. This is where the UN also will have a role to play. And then a number of other things. Then yes, the issues like looking at the minorities, the question of when I was High Commissioner on National Minorities, I was invited to the Security Council to talk about the Ukrainian language law. Those are issues on which there was no need to pick a fight. And there could have been easier solutions, longer time frames to reform. I kept saying, it's in Ukraine has every right to decide what is their national language, but it's important to give space to those who speak different languages and assign different time frames. Do not close schools overnight, and this kind of things to avoid creating additional. So you can work on all these things in the context of a settlement. But the security guarantees, to me, will be the key issue. Security guarantees for Ukraine, but also making sure that Russia in future, and we'll have to see also what happens inside Russia, but the Russia in future feels more comfortable in its own skin somehow, and that in itself will become a guarantee of stability for the international community at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Kateryna, I agree with Lamberto that these huge issues of security and the status of Ukraine are going to be at the heart of any settlement. But perhaps prior to that, or supplementary to that, and of course, peacebuilders have to keep, however bad things are looking, and my God, they're looking bad at the moment, one must always look to see if there are, just keep looking, however hopeless it seems, for opportunities. Do you think there are any entry points on other issues that are sort of less of the hardcore security issues than that? For example, women, peace and security, or transitional justice. Are there other entry points for topics such as that, in your opinion?
Yes, they are, but I think the key entry points are the more framework entry points. And to going back what we have just discussed now, and Russia being comfortable in its own skin, I think judging by the public statements of President Putin and the articles like what Russia should do to Ukraine published on state-owned Russian media, we can understand that they will be comfortable in their own skin only when they go back to the borders that the USSR had, or the Russian Empire it used to have. Of course, this is not something acceptable to Ukraine, and hopefully this is not something that is or will be acceptable for the international community and for the rule-based order, which we have tried to develop since the World War II. Second, the important point which I wanted to make concerns the issues we have been facing since 2014, and this is something we have to take into account with the possible future peace agreement, which it was a mistake of numerous Western partners of Ukraine to divide the issues of Crimea and Donbass. If the historical lecture of President Putin and the current assault on Ukraine do not persuade the world that there is a common intention towards what has been done to Crimea and Donbass and Ukraine now, then I don't know what can persuade. These situations pursue the same goal, and in fact, the practices of the re-education of the population or the demographical change of the population, which we have noticed in Crimea and in Donbass areas before 2014, is something which Russia is gradually implementing on the territories, which it is overtaken in the current new wave of aggression. So I would stress that it's very important that any peace deal looks not only at what has been happening since February this year, or indeed just what has been happening in eastern and northeastern Ukraine, but also doesn't forget about Crimea. As regards the topics, first, I would want to stress, I would actually want to go back to what Natalia said about the civil society support of the state. I think for those who are not very familiar with the Ukrainian context, it's important to stress that the support and the cooperation of the civil society with the government does not mean that the civil society is biased. And I think this is a great phenomenon of Ukraine, because on the one hand, there would be great cooperation, for instance, in evidence collection, in submitting communications to the International Criminal Court between the human rights group and the Office of the Prosecutor General. On the other hand, positively, the civil society would always stay very vocal and very critical when they think that the government does not do its job and does not live up to the expectations. For instance, the ratification of the Rome Statute, which hasn't happened, or the issues with the corruptions or transparency of the judiciary. So the role of the civil society and the wider negotiations and consultations with civil society and victim groups is something that has to be at the core of the procedure of the making of the possible peace agreement. As regards the themes, indeed, women, peace and security and transitional justice are the issues that Ukraine has been working on quite hard pre-February this year, and are the issues that should be at the core of the possible peace agreement. Ukraine, both the state and the civil society, have gradually come to realize that the disproportionate focus only on accountability does not create this narrative that Natalia has been speaking about, this creative of the larger narrative of the causes of the conflict, of its impact on the society. And more importantly, just the narrow focus on accountability does not serve the victims in terms of the practical help of reparations, financial compensations, medical help. So it is important that the peace agreement does look at the justice for the victims of Russia's aggression quite comprehensively, that we speak not only about the support and the development of domestic criminal proceedings in Ukraine, or domestic criminal proceedings in foreign jurisdictions, and we know that so far 9 states have already launched proceedings concerning the armed conflict in Ukraine in their domestic criminal justice systems. And not only the proceedings in international criminal courts, but also the wider approach to the establishing the truth about the conflict, the possible truth commission, the institutional reforms which Ukraine wants to implement. And again, if there are certain issues with the language, I disagree that the issue of the Ukrainian language was not urgent. And again, Natalia, as a journalist, perhaps could comment on that. I would say that the Russian-speaking journalists would have more freedom publishing in Ukraine rather than would do in Russia. And finally, the peace agreement should necessarily stress that when we speak about reparations, we speak about the reparations not only to Ukraine as a state, we're speaking about individual reparations to survivors of the specific crimes of this armed conflict. And I think the pre-February 22 period has demonstrated that Ukraine has not always been ideal in terms of engaging women in the peacemaking process. And my favorite unfortunate example would be the first civil society group in the Minsk process, when all 4 members of the group were men. That, of course, should change, because we have seen the particular victimization of women, elderly women and girls in this armed conflict. We have seen the role of service women in this armed conflict. We recently saw the threat of female prisoners of war. So the engagement of women, not just as the recipients of help, as victims, but also the engagement of them in the actual process of negotiating the agreements and its modalities and voicing their needs, is something that has to be ensured throughout this whole process. Thank you.
My last question is to you, Jörg. In our in our ecosystem. I don't know how it is in yours, in the peacebuilders community. There is a fair amount of concern that, however justified the talk and the emphasis on militarization and the militarized discourse, and we absolutely get why, in light of the threat that was actually always there, but people have only woken up to quite recently. And now the atrocities again, which we had pretty good ideas, but now the evidence is much more overwhelming. Like we get that there has to be a security response, but frankly, it's not enough. True security isn't brought just by increasing military expenditures. And I just wonder, what do you think about how we might keep a sense of perspective, and how it's absolutely very, very important to still keep investing in peace building and the other factors that we've been hearing about from Natalia and Kateryna on transitional justice and women, peace and security, and of course humanitarian, that goes without saying. But I do think there is a slight danger that there will be, although it's understandable, that there will be just too much emphasis put on military and security at the expense of everything else. What do you feel?
Sure. I mean, speaking from a German perspective, we tend to go to think about conflicts not from a security or a militarized standpoint. It's a common understanding that usually the military is not the solution. That's even common sense here, and we have to rethink now in the face of this level of violence that we're seeing that is really shocking, this attitude. So we're coming from the other side and have to accommodate ourselves with the role the military has to play here. And I have to say, I have a problem. I feel uneasy with the term conflict here. It's a very abstract concept. This is not a conflict in the normal sense of the word. I mean, Germany didn't have a conflict in 1939 with Poland, and this is something similar. It's an attack and it's resistance. And unless the Ukrainian military prevails, we don't have to talk about any kind of negotiation, and we don't have to think about any plans how to make it happen. So that's the precondition for talks, is that the Russian military has to feel, and the leadership has to feel, that they're failing and they can't achieve their aims by violent means. And I'm afraid, and I'm adding to the darkness here that's already present in this panel. We haven't seen the worst of it and not the last of it. There will be a second wave of attack in the south, and it has to be repelled first, and then we can talk or try to negotiate along the lines that Kateryna just mentioned. The ideas are out there, but we're not there yet.
Natalia, are you putting your pen up?
Yeah, I probably want to finish with something short. I read so many scenarios and earlier of what might happen to Ukraine. What I always missing in all this discussion and scenarios, like any vision of Ukraine winning. And I'm sitting now in Kiev, which I started my discussion, which suburbs lived through the horrendous, crimes, what we discuss now. But the city feels like it has won this war. City is, Ukrainians can imagine the victory. They really have the very clear vision of that. They don't need to imagine that. It's for them bringing back their towns, rebuilding infrastructure, making them livable to the people, and probably, having as less territory as possible under the military action, with having all enough defense to be able to defend the people. Because Kyiv was able to survive, at least so far. We understand things could be worse, but so far at this stage, compared to what was said by the intelligence that it would fall in couple of days, partially because the people, that there were fights around and the people were not allowed, the Russians were now to enter, but also because Ukraine had a very strong air defense in Kiev that saved the town. So Ukrainians have very, very clear picture. And I think raising these debates, I feel very sad and tragic about things which are upcoming in the Donbass. But I do think we have also this image in mind of the Ukrainian victory, apart from, all this sadness and grief we're talking. I think it's really missing, but Ukrainians, more than 95% of the Ukrainians are believing in the fact that Ukraine may win this war. They feel just very tragic by the price they should pay.
There is undeniably, and it has already been an extraordinarily high price, and we all fear it's going to get a lot higher, particularly as you just hinted at the end, Natalia, in the East. Certainly, you talk about the feelings in Kiev at the moment, but the world's media is full of, well, world media, the West media is full of foreboding about what is the onslaught that's going to happen in the East right now. But in any case, thank you all very, very much indeed, Natalia, Kateryna, Umberto, Jörg. That has been a really, really interesting set of responses, and I deeply appreciate all four of you making the time to join us today. So a big thanks to you and to everybody else who listened in as well. Wish you very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.